friends, in the series which we are doing on history of India from 1700 to 1950, today we will talk about the expansion and consolidation of the British power with a special reference to Bengal. In the earlier lecture in which we talked about the expansion of the colonial power in the context of Bengal, we talked about that how the regional kingdoms during that particular point of time came up and how the regional kingdoms or the successor states which they were being called at that point of time, and how the Nawabs of Bengal, they were able to establish their authority over a period of time, and how British and Siraj-ud-Daulah, they came into conflict with each other, and the activities of the British, they were not liked by Siraj-ud-Daulah, and he was in a way wanted to establish his own authority, which was not liked by the British, because of which we find that the Battle of Plassey was fought, and in the Battle of Plassey we find that how Siraj-ud-Daulah was replaced by Mir Jafar, and Mir Jafar, who in a way played to be some sort of a traitor, he shook his hand with the British and he dished the Nawab Siraj-ud-Daulah, and he himself became the Nawab. So this kind of a war, which was actually was not a war in that sense, because it was fought for a very short period of time, and not many people, they lost their lives, hardly 500 people, and largely it was the result of the treachery of the British. So we find that how British, they use all sorts of treacheries and deceits, and they call them as their tactics. And when one is talking about Plassey, we find that from the military point of view, it was not a very important kind of a war. It was just some kind of a skirmish, and many casualties could not be seen in this war, and how Plassey also put the British yoke on Bengal as well. And when one also is talking about the importance of the battle, then we find that how the Plassey plunder gave a lot of wealth to the British English Navy and Army. They received a lot of money, as you can see on the screen as well. And we also find that how Mir Jafar paid rupees 22.5 million between 1757 to 1760 to the East India Company. And even Clive, he was given the personal Jagir of worth rupees 34,567 pounds. So we find that all the people, those who were associated in the Battle of Plassey, especially the British, they were able to in a way secure some kind of money for themselves on personal level, or for that matter we find that the kind of money which was being given to the East India Company. So we also see that the resources, they also in a way helped the British to conquer the wars of Deccan and extend its influence over northern India as well. And over a period of time, East India Company monopolized the trade and commerce in Bengal, and the other companies, they lost, because British, they were able to in a way establish their preeminence, and rest of the companies, they lost any kind of eminence which they had in India. So the consequences of the Plassey, they shaped the British rule and the mode of the cultural contact as well. And we also find that there was a lot of change in the character of the company. Now the East India Company became commercial, military, political body. So in that sense, the importance of Plassey could only be understood when we tend to see that how it played an important role in the establishment of the colonial rule in India, how British, they were able to secure themselves in India, and with Bengal they also got a lot of wealth, and how this wealth was utilized to fight the wars in other regions. And at the same time we also find that during this particular period the character of the company also changed as well, because earlier they came only as merchants, but now company was also acting as some sort of a military political body as well. And we also find that with the Battle of Plassey, the British, they were able to secure not only wealth but some kind of a legitimacy as well, because now in that sense the kind of money which they got in India, and with this kind of money they could fund other kind of things as well, in terms of wars, in terms of their own personal expenses. And when it also in a way developed, the situation developed for them where they could directly control India in the framework of the control of Bengal, when the Battle of Buxar was fought. And the Battle of Buxar also provided them some kind of a legitimacy, when we find that the revenue rights of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, they were being given to the East India Company. So with this we find that they were able to secure a lot of money, and with this money they were also able to in a way help themselves and the East India Company in India, as well as also secure support from Britain as well. We also see that how East India Company was after money and wealth, and they were not concerned with the kind of ties they developed with the Indian rulers. And one of the cases again in the context of Bengal, where we find the revolution of 1760 and how Mir Jafar was removed. And when you see that the situation of Mir Jafar, we realize that Mir Jafar became very poor by paying a lot of money to the company, and he did not have enough money to sustain himself. And so company now entered into a treaty with Mir Qasim in 1760, who was the son-in-law of Mir Jafar, and he provided a lot of territories and money to the East India Company, and Mir Jafar was pensioned off. So we find that East India Company was more interested in securing its own revenues and its own money, rather than having any kind of obligations or relations with the Indian officials or the people, those who had supported it. And we find that when Mir Qasim provided the East India Company as a better bet, then they were ready to support him. And we find that he was comparatively a good administrator, and he transferred his capital from Murshidabad to Munger, which was safe distance from Calcutta. He also modernized and reorganized his army on the European lines, and the manufacture of guns at Munger also began. He also in a way levied new taxes. Additional tax of 1.5 annas was imposed during his time. So we find that how Mir Qasim in a way was trying to improve his finances, how he was trying to improve his administration, so that he is able to administer in a far better manner. And he also realized the intentions of the British, that how British they were trying to exact as much as possible from Bengal. So he did not want in any way to burden his own subjects. So in this sense we find that how Mir Qasim and East Indian Company, they also came into conflict with each other. They also had some kind of differences, and the main issue was the issue of the interlopers, who were the private English or the European merchants. And we find that how the methods of the English traders and their gumashtas were a growing menace to the political authority of Mir Qasim. And when Mir Qasim objected on the misuse of the East India Company's dastaks, dastak was a pass chit or a permit by the president of the Calcutta Council, which exempted the goods which were specified from the payment of duties. So when this thing was being done, that the private servants of the East India Companies, they were also taking advantage of the dastaks for their own trade, and at the same time we also find that they were also helping their Indian friends, so that these Indian friends do not pay the taxes which were to be paid by them, so which put the other traders at some kind of a disadvantage. So we find that how Nawab was also losing the taxes which were not being paid by the servants of the East India Company, and how the East India Company servants, they indulged in the inland private trade without payment of any duties, which was detrimental to the interests of the Nawab. And we, as I told you, that how they were selling the dastaks to the Indian merchants for some kind of a commission as well, and how they in a way showed a lot of arrogance. The East India Company officials or servants, they also showed a lot of arrogance, and they flouted the authority of Nawab. and the officials of Nawab, they were also at many times disgraced by them. So we find that the East India Company servants, they were also trying to use a lot of coercion to buy at cheap rates as well. So all these kinds of activities of the East India Company servants, they were not in a good taste, and Nawab did not like them at all. And at the same time, they were not only giving the Nawab some kind of a loss in terms of the taxes which would have come to them, but at the same time it was also detrimental to his position, because they were totally disregarding the Nawab while they were acting in such a fashion. And when one is talking about this kind of a behavior of the servants, then we find that the authority of the Nawab was diminished. It was not getting any kind of a due from the servants of the East India Company, and the revenue definitely was reduced, and the position of the Indian subjects, it also became helpless, because the position of Nawab itself was in danger in that sense. So what will happen to the Indian subjects, those who were dependent on Nawab? So we find that how during this particular period, Nawab or Mir Qasim admitted the English traders to a share in inland trade, provided they paid 9% duty on the prime cost of commodities. And Nawab was alone in this, and he was competent to grant dastak. This is what he talked about. And the Calcutta Council rejected this kind of an idea, which was to be in terms of an agreement. And we find that they welcomed the clash with Mir Qasim, and they were not ready that Nawab should only be competent to grant dastak. So Mir Qasim abolished all inland duties which were there in his kingdom, and Indian merchants now were same as the British merchants. So this was a big move by him, and we find that when he decided this, then there was some kind of a situation which led to the war, and there was a battle of Buxar, and in this battle of Buxar we find that how British, they were able to in a way improve their situation by winning this battle. And we also find that during this particular period, how British, they were able to establish their position in India, and how during this particular period the control of India was also in the British hands. So this battle, which was the Battle of Buxar, was a decisive battle in that sense, and treaties of Allahabad with Awadh as well as Shah Alam II, who was the Mughal ruler, they were being concluded by the East India Company. And with these kinds of treaties, we find that how East India Company emerged as a dominant force at this point of time. And we also find that how money was being paid to the East India Company as war indemnity, whatever they had lost during the war. So money was paid for that, and the subordinate position of Awadh and Shah Alam II under the East India Company protection was also there in this treaty. And one of the important concerns was the Farman, which was granting the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar and Odisha to the East India Company, making them the political players and access to revenue for the investment. So it was one of the important development which happened during this time, that the Farman granting the Diwani rights of Bengal, Bihar and Odisha was given by the Mughal emperor to the East India Company, and how East India Company became the political ruler in that sense, because the right to collection of revenue is generally given to a ruler, and they also were now getting a lot of revenue from this region, which was a rich region, and how they were in a way using this kind of a revenue for their own purposes. And we also find that how Awadh as a state was created as some sort of a buffer state because of the impact of Farman, and how Mughal emperor was now merely a pensioner. He was just some sort of a rubber stamp which could be used by the East India Company, and how the settlement of Bengal, which was the dual system, in the where we find that the East India Company acquired the real power in terms of the revenue collection, while the responsibility for administration was on the Nawab. So we find that this kind of a system, which was known as the diarchy or the dual system, dual or the double government at this point of time, in 1765, when Najmuddaulah he became the Nawab. As you can see on the screen as well, that how he practically surrendered Nizamat function, that is the military, defense and foreign affairs, to the East India Company, and civil administration took care of a deputy Subedar to be named by the East India Company. So in this way we find that how Nawab became comparatively weaker, because the power of money or the power of revenue collection, it rested with the East India Company. And the people, those who were in the East India Company, they were providing all sorts of justification for this kind of a rule, where we find that if they will openly assume the power, the East India Company will assume the power, then it might unite the Indian princes. This is how they try to justify it. And they also say that other Europeans may not pay duties on trade to East India Company. This is what they felt. So they had to collect the duties on trade from other companies as well. And they also say that how it could also create complications in England's diplomatic relations with the European powers as well. So we find that the East India Company was trying to justify all sorts of things which they were doing in Bengal for their own personal benefit. And we also find that and they also tried to justify it on the ground that how East India Company did not have the trained personnel to carry out the administration, language, customs, etc. And we also see that the court of directors, they were also not in favor in terms of acquisition, because they were more interested in commerce and finance. And they also argued that the British Parliament might interfere with the affairs of the East India Company if open assumption of political power takes place. So in that sense we find that the system of diarchy had a very adverse effect on Bengal, and because of which we find corruption and anarchy and all sorts of decline in the administration. And that was from the administrative point of view, but from the point of view of agriculture we find that there was a lot of misery and famine because of such kind of a system. And we also find the disruption of trade and commerce because of the kind of a system which was followed by them. So from the economic, from administrative, all points of view, we find that this kind of a system was totally detrimental to the interests of Bengal. We also see that how industry and skill was also ruined because of this. And the silk fabrics, they competed with the fabrics which were manufactured in Britain. And later we also see it in the framework of the monopolization of trade by the East India Company, and how when they were taking the raw materials out of India, the prices of the raw materials, they increased. And it could also be seen in the framework of the deindustrialization, where the Indian industries, they could not survive or compete with the British industries. At the same time we also see some sort of a moral degradation as well, because there was no incentive to work and the society became more and more static and decayed. So we find that this kind of a dual system which was there, it was not in that sense where we find that some kind of a benefit to the Indians could have occurred, but rather all sorts of benefits, they occurred to the East India Company, and it was in the interest of the East India Company to carry on with this kind of a system. And we find that as British, they came as traders in the initial part, and they were more interested in their trade. And when they were able to establish themselves after the Battle of Buxar in India, we find that they were able to secure the revenues, and with that revenue they were able to invest in terms of securing the raw materials, and these raw materials could be exported out of India to Europe, especially Britain. And when one is talking about the various phases of mercantilism, the various phases of capitalism, then we find that British, they engage in three stages of capitalism. First was the mercantile, second was the industrial, and third was the finance. So this period in a way coincided with the industrial kind of a capitalism, where British now they wanted to take away the raw materials out of India, which were needed for the British industries, because the industrial revolution had already taken place in Britain, and the raw materials, they were required in Britain at that point of time. And we find that the India was a place, rich place in terms of raw materials as well as for the finished products. So when the raw materials, they were being taken out of India, we find that the Indian handicraftsmen, they could not secure the raw materials at a lower price, and whenever they could secure these raw materials at a higher price, and all these finished products by the Indian handicraftsmen, they were handmade, for which we'll find that the cost of the product will be comparatively higher when you compare it with the products which were sent by the East India Company. And the products of the East India Company were were machine made, and because of being machine made, we find that they were comparatively lesser in cost. That is how we find that how the Indian handicraftsmen, they lost as buyers and they lost as sellers as well, because they were not able to purchase the raw material at a lower price, and as sellers they were not able to find buyers because the cheap British products, they were available to the Indians. We also see that because of the dual system, we find that some kind of a moral degradation could be seen in the society, and at the same time society also became static and some kind of a decay could be seen. We also see during this particular period that how we find that when British, they were talking in this particular framework, and when they were talking about all these kinds of ideas, they realized that they had to take certain concrete steps so as to in a way correct the situation. And this was in the framework of the various kinds of policies which were in a way followed by them. And they also realized that once they will take care of the financial aspect, then they will be able to take care of the political and the cultural issues as well. And this got reflected in the later times when we see that how British, when they were able to secure their finances in India, then they in a way interfered in other states as well, whether the Marathas for that matter, or we find that they were also interfering in other states as well. So from the political point of view, they made such kind of inroads because they had money, whether they were fighting wars with Mysore, with Marathas. And from the cultural point of view, we find that how they made some kind of an introduction of the English language, and they also wanted that the Western education should be provided to the Indians, and how they had to make India or the Indians realize that Indians were in a way inferior to the British. So for that we find that the different kinds of ideological positions which were there in Britain at that point of time, all these ideological positions, they were also trying to communicate this kind of an idea that Indians, they were inferior to the British. And we also see that some of the European scholars, they in a way say that India was in a way achieved or in a way possessed by the British only as an accident, and it was not conscious at all. So there was no consistent policy in the framework of the conquest. And but it appears to be that how deliberately British, they tried to did it, and their reasons were very clear, because we find that the British, they had to expand themselves not only for the commercial reasons, but at the same time they also wanted to establish their authority from the political and military point of view. So with this, I'd like to end the discussion. Thank you very much.